42 years ago, the U.S. imperialist war against the people of Vietnam was still raging, in spite of military victories on the battlefield by the Vietnamese people, and a massive anti-war movement here at home. On the heels of the civil rights movement, African-American revolutionaries like the Black Panthers were standing up to racist police brutality and murders. The heroic Stonewall Rebellion against anti-gay bigotry had launched what is now the LGBTQ liberation movement. The women's liberation movement was re-educating the country through the struggle for equal rights. And the postal workers won a tremendous strike whose gains have lasted till today, when they are now severely threatened. Wasn't it a time? For a young 19-year-old college student, there did not seem to be a lot of motivation to continue my college education or miseducation, when there seemed to be a chance to change the world. I dropped out of NYU after 2 years, and my parents forced me to see a psychiatrist in order for me to receive an honorable leave of absence from my college. At that time, there was an involuntary draft conscripting particularly African American and Latino youth to fight and die in a rich man's war in Indochina. There was massive resistance to the draft, including by boxing heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali. At that time, college students got an automatic deferment from the draft. I forfeited that when I quit college. I went to the psychiatrist for about 7 months, debated with him the classification of the American Psychiatric Association of attraction to the same sex as a mental disorder, and finally, when my parents convinced the doctor to write a psychiatric note to excuse me from the draft, when I did not want that stigma attached to me, I fired the psychiatrist. I had joined Youth Against War and Fascism, or YOF, and Workers' World Party the previous October. YOF had held the first U.S. demonstration against the war in Vietnam in August 1962. When the draft board came after me, I enlisted the help of WW's legal genius, Marianne Negro Weissman, who in 1967, along with Key Martin, served 6 months in jail in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in support of the right of American GIs to form a union, the American Servicemen's Union. Using the post office's registered mail many times, I successfully contested the draft board's order for me to report for my physical because they had mailed the report notice to the wrong address. That was my method of resistance to the draft. When I got my government job in 1974, I had some difficulty in adjusting to the discipline of a full-time job, which I had never had before. I was referred to a psychiatrist who used antipsychotic medications. These included haloperidol or Haldol, Moban, and Mellaril. I began to have serious side effects such as drowsiness, disorientation, uncontrollable shaking, inability to sleep, and unusual sensitivity to heat. I began to have more serious problems on my job because of these side effects than I had had before I was medicated. After 5 years, I could not take the debilitating effects of the medicine any longer, and I reached out to the psychiatrist I had fired in 1971 for a second opinion. By then, he, as well as the American Psychiatric Association, had changed his opinion regarding diagnosing attraction to the same sex as an illness. He advised me that I was one of millions of people who had been misdiagnosed with schizophrenia, when all of my symptoms pointed clearly to a different diagnosis, calling for either no medication or a completely different medication. The psychiatrist suggested that I go to the library so as to better understand myself, how I had been misdiagnosed. I was weaned off the drugs gradually for about 9 months. I do not remember the technical term for his diagnosis, which I've accepted for myself. My nickname for it is turtle syndrome. I am much slower than other people at some everyday physical tasks, and I am often scapegoated for this. I told the other doctor, who had medicated me for nearly 6 years and refused to listen to my complaints about the meds, that I was firing him. Since June 1981, I have been off any and all antipsychotic medications. In that time, I returned to college, earned a Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics, received 3 promotions on my job, and I haven't taken a sick day on my job for 30 years. I had discussed with Workers' World Party member Betsy Gimbel, Secretary of Disabled in Action, my experience with the antipsychotic medication. Betsy, who died in 2004, led the fight for access to mass transit for the disabled, including wheelchair lifts for New York City buses. This struggle included the disabled blocking buses with their wheelchairs, demanding that these public vehicles be made accessible, a demand which was won. Betsy told me that many people with my experience considered themselves emotionally disabled and not necessarily ill. I felt wonderful when Betsy said that. After all, the term sicko or just sick is one of many derogatory terms often used against people with emotional, psychiatric, and mental disabilities, along with psycho, lunatic, dangerous, nuts, brain dead, loony, screw loose, demented, freak, and some 250 others, which I Googled on my computer yesterday. Betsy invited me to participate in the disabled workshop in the historic All People's Congress in Detroit in October 1981, as I identified myself for the first time as a person with an emotional disability. In 1993, I received an urgent call from my mother. She had been hospitalized at Long Island Jewish Hospital. I found out that she was being medicated against her will with some of the same antipsychotic drugs which I had been subjected to, and that because she had refused to take her meds and called 911 3 times when she had chest pains, a relative and a psychiatrist signed her in for a stay at Strauss College at Hillside Psychiatric Hospital, where she was held for 3 weeks until she would agree to take her meds and comply with an elder care plan of 7 days a week home care, which my father would have to pay for. My mother was forced to wear an ankle bracelet so she wouldn't run away. When I visited her, a Holocaust survivor was being given electric shock treatment for her nightmares about the Holocaust. My mother was never the same after this, and she died 2 years later. I vowed to not let this happen to my father, for whom I was the primary caregiver for the last 7 years of his life. I believe that the only proper elder health care plan is one that is in the best interest of the elder, and not necessarily in the best interest of the relative, the caregiver, or the medical provider. I wish to relate my experience and that of this group of the disabled in the proper perspective that, like every other disabled person, we should have the unconditional right, authority, and opportunity to be a spokesperson for our own individual condition and disability. In an article in Workers' World newspaper in April 1982, I wrote, "Psychological abuse, while often more sophisticated than in previous centuries, when persons deviating from normal behavior were often caged, tortured, and burned, is nonetheless prevalent in this country. Many people, for instance, have gone through the trauma of withdrawal from medically prescribed antipsychotic drugs only to learn shortly thereafter that they had been misdiagnosed. Michael Stieglitz, 28, died last July at Bronx State Hospital when his brain literally fried to death after being given similar drugs in a non-air-conditioned hospital room. The war against the emotionally, mentally, and psychologically disabled has been part and parcel of the war against all oppressed people throughout history. The burning of witches in the last millennium has often been called the Holocaust against women. Estimates range from the hundreds to the millions of people who were put to death on the charge of witchcraft, often accused of displaying symptoms which correspond to a modern psychiatric diagnosis. 85% of those executed for witchcraft were women. The term Holocaust is often used to refer to the murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazis during World War II, but many other groups were also targeted by the Nazis. More than 400,000 people were declared unworthy to live and reproduce and sterilized against their will by the Nazis, while another 70,000 were killed under Action T4, a euthanasia or mercy-killing program targeting mainly the mentally ill and LGBTQ people. The Rockefeller Foundation in the United States helped develop and fund various German eugenic programs, including the one that Joseph Mengele worked in before he went to the infamous death camp Auschwitz. Societies have cast aside the mentally ill throughout history. For many years, a majority of committed patients were confined to cages, locked rooms, and outhouses. The only treatment available were the following: barbiturates, bromides, narcotics, and drugs for sedation, soothing baths, shock therapy with insulin, atropine or convulsant drugs, and neurosurgery that included prefrontal leucotomy and lobotomy. In the 1950s, a new era in the treatment of psychiatric disorders began with the introduction of psychotropic drugs. How is this disability handled in the prisons? While African Americans make up 13.6% of the U.S. population, according to census data, African American men reportedly make up 40.2% of all prison inmates. Ohio State University law professor and civil rights activist Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, stipulates that there are now more African American men in prison and jail or on probation and parole than were slaves before the start of the Civil War. In 1990, in the case Washington versus Harper, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a state can treat an incarcerated inmate having a serious mental disorder with antipsychotic medication against his or her will under the condition that he or she is dangerous to himself or herself or others, and the medication prescribed is in his or her best medical interests. This reaffirms that prisoners do not have the same rights as non-prisoners to refuse antipsychotic medications. In an excellent article in this week's Workers' World by Larry Hales, Behind the Colorado Massacre, Hales quotes Julie Fry, a legal aid attorney in Brooklyn, New York. Mental illness is not generally well understood or appreciated at all within the criminal justice system. In fact, prisons have become essentially warehouses for people with mental illness, while social services and medical networks designed for the treatment of these illnesses have been gutted systematically through budget cuts over recent decades. Far from using it as an excuse to escape prison, people with mental illness usually receive much worse treatment in jail and are likely to receive longer sentences than other people. How is this disability handled for veterans and GIs? An August 3, 2011 article in the New York Times entitled "Antipsychotic Use is Questioned for Combat Stress" reported that drugs widely prescribed to treat post-traumatic stress symptoms for veterans are no more effective than placebos and come with serious side effects, including weight gain and fatigue. 10 to 20% of those who see heavy combat develop lasting symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and about a fifth of those who get treatment receive a prescription for a so-called antipsychotic medication, according to government numbers. A study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association focused on one medication, Risperdal, but experts said that its results most likely extend to the entire class, including drugs like Seroquel, Geodon, and Abilify. The use of such drugs has grown sharply over the past decade, as thousands of returning soldiers and Marines have found that their post-traumatic stress symptoms do not respond to antidepressants, the only drugs generally prescribed for the disorder. Doctors have turned to antipsychotics, which strongly affect mood, to augment treatment based almost entirely on their experience with them and how they expect them to work. These drugs, used to treat severe mental illness like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, are sometimes prescribed to troops in lower doses to supposedly alleviate symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, including nightmares and irritabilities. However, when they are mixed with other prescriptions, they can be dangerous and sometimes fatal.